thanks for tuning in. We are starting a new series today called The Greatest. Now, I don't know about you guys, but during this time in quarantine, I have been listening to the radio and podcasts a whole heck of a lot more. And it's interesting because right now I'm listening to a lot of sports radio stations and podcasts. And right now, there aren't any sports really going on right now. So what they're doing is they're doing the top 10s. They're talking about the top 10 greatest athletes, top 10 greatest movies, sports movies for each genre. So basketball, baseball, football, soccer, and hockey. And it's interesting because this kind of gets into what this whole entire series is going to be about. The greatest. The whole argument that people come up with, yeah, the top 10 is great, but really what they're really going to talk about and discuss is the number one. Their greatest movie, the greatest athlete, the greatest of all time, the GOAT, if you will. And I think that this is something that happens with all of us. We all aspire to either be the greatest or make sure that we know who the greatest is, in our opinion, right? I don't know if you guys have anybody who likes to argue in your family. I was a huge person who would love to argue with anybody about anything. And one of the biggest things that I found is with my friends is we would argue all the time about what's the greatest music that's going on right now. What's the greatest movie that's coming out? Greatest video game, greatest sport, greatest artistic achievement. I don't think we talked about that, but that was definitely probably on the table to discuss. But it's interesting because if you've ever argued with someone or ever debated with someone about who is the greatest whatever, you can find a person that doesn't see the same as you, and you'll end up arguing back and forth who's the greatest. They think they're right and you think you're right, and that's really the beauty of it, is you both think you're 100% right and you're 100% confident in that answer. And this brings us into our topic. So people want to know who's the greatest or what's the greatest. So to answer the question of who's the greatest or what's the greatest, as people want to know, and why, like the question I ask is why? Why do people care who's the greatest or what is the greatest? And I think it's rather simple. I think it's because of the fact that we pick the greatest thing out of us liking that or loving that person, that sport, that artistic expression, whatever it is, that video game. Something about it makes us love it, makes us for it, in meaning that we are for something, like we are going to be trying our best to make everybody love this one thing. And I think that we can all agree that we all have things that we are for, right? We all have things that we love. We all have things that we want everybody to love with us. And then there are things that we don't love. There are things that we hate. Maybe that's a strong word, or maybe it's not strong enough. But we have things that we're against. Like we do not like this. And I think here's an example. For an example, and I'm going to flip this a little bit, but I don't think we've ever heard someone say, well, I'm for going to the dentist. Am I right? Normally when you ask someone, hey, how do you feel about going to the dentist? They're going to say, oh, I hate it. I'm against it. I'd rather not. And I think that gets to the point of the greatest. So, I mean, the greatest is something we like or something we're for. Video games, we're for the best video game. sports. We're for a specific sport. Whether you like basketball best, hockey, soccer, baseball, football, all of these different sports, you have one that you love, or maybe a couple that you love, that you're for, that you love to watch and want other people to watch. And when you find someone who is for it as much as you are, there's a new friendship right there. So basically what I'm trying to get at is the greatest and to be for something go hand in hand. They're one and the same, right? We love something, therefore we want to know who's the greatest at it. Or we are for a specific video game, we want that video game to be hailed as one of the greats. Same with any kind of athletic person. Now, in the same way, I feel like we're going to shift our focus onto people, right? So we have people that we are for, people we love, people we like enough to be called friends, right? Our friends would be in our category called for. We're for them. We want them to succeed. We want to help them out. We want to love them. We want them to be the greatest group of friends ever. But we also have those that are against us, seem to find everything and anything to stop us, to make it so that we don't succeed. I think that we have some people that you can think of. For me, one teacher that I had, I for sure was thinking that she was against me in every single way. And I never found out whether she was or not. I doubt she was. I just wanted her to be against me so it made it easier for the bad grades I was getting. But we rarely find people who, let's take teachers for an example. We rarely will find a person who's like, oh yeah, my chemistry teacher was always against me, always like picked on me in class, always made sure that I made an example of me when I did something wrong, and would always be very harsh on me. But she was the greatest teacher. She was so wise, and she was really like on the cutting edge floor of her field and trying to teach that to us. So she was the greatest teacher I ever had. I don't think that's how it's going to go. I don't know maybe, but 9 times out of 10, I doubt that. You're going to find a teacher, you're going to say the greatest teacher is the one that was always for you, the one that was always there when you had forgotten your homework or forgot to do it, and they were like, you know what, take an extra day, get it done, hand it in. Or they were ones that would let you get away with maybe some stuff in class that normally other teachers wouldn't let you. And with that, you'd say, yeah, that was the greatest teacher, the greatest person, because I am for that teacher, because that teacher was for me. And normally what happens is once, like, you have the two camps, you have the people you're for and the people you're against. And rarely, very rarely, can a person from the against camp come into the for camp, right? It would have to take a whole bunch of stuff for one person who was always against you to end up being in a group that you're always for. Now I want you to shift your focus and think about God for a second. Now, I don't know about you, but I've always had these feelings sometimes or these questions of, well, is God really for me? Is he rooting me on, cheering me on, or is he against me? Because sometimes it feels like he is making sure that I don't succeed, making sure that what I do doesn't really turn up to anything. It kind of fizzles out. And I know that, like, if I was asked at church on the spot, especially when I was like in high school, if someone were to ask me, hey, do you think God is for you or against you? And without missing a beat, I would say, well, God is for me. Even though sometimes, actually most of the time, I felt like God was against me. And that was always hard because I felt like I was lying, and I was lying to the person that asked. And I really felt like God really had it out for me to make sure that I didn't get anywhere and nothing really happened to me. And I don't know, maybe you felt that same way. And because sometimes that's how it feels, right? Now, maybe that's from a certain situation that you were put in and you really prayed for God to help you out and nothing happened. Or maybe you heard the list of things that you should not do and that made it difficult for you. And you're like, man, God really doesn't want me to have that much fun, does he? Or maybe you heard, and this one's probably the hardest one to ignore, you heard other Christians speaking down on somebody, or maybe speaking down on you, and you're like, man, if this is what a follower of God is going to do, I don't even want to know what God is or what he does, because he's automatically against me just off of what they've said. And seeing things like this really makes us think that God really is mostly against us. Rather, he's more against us than he is for us. And even if it's an even split, we're going to lean towards the against because really we haven't seen how God could ever be for us. Because isn't it true that sometimes we feel like as a Christian, God is against everything. And we spend so much time talking about what God is against that I think we lose sight of what God is for. I mean, think about it. If you've ever struggled with something, struggled with a sin, and you're like, man, I know that God is against whatever this sin is. Whatever this sin is. And I'm pretty sure he's against it. So he must be against me because I'm doing it. Now I want to bring this full circle, and really the only way I can is by asking this question. And I'm going to read it just to make sure I don't mess it up. Do you feel like the greatest thing to God is that we don't do the things he's against? Let me say that one more time. Do you feel like the greatest thing to God is that we don't do the things he's against? If you answered yes to that question, or if you have kind of a mixed feeling about it, you're like a yes or a no, somewhere in between, we're going to take a look at a passage today that hopefully will help you out. It's a passage that is an exchange between this person and Jesus, and we're going to look at how this verse or this couple verses really kind of shows that God is not against us, but really for us, and for us so much that it's insane. One of the many reasons that God sent Jesus down to earth was to show us who God really is. I mean, think about it. Jesus is and was God sent down on earth. It was God down on earth in a human form, fully divine, fully human. It's insane. And I mean, we could go on and on about how that's just a mind exploding thing. But what we really look at here is that this gives us an ability to look at God and to see everything that God is through the eyes of a human. In other words, if you want to know about God, the best place to look is at Jesus. Now, I know that you probably know this, but if you don't, I want to let you know that Jesus, when he came down on earth, was not welcomed very much. There were thousands of people who would flock to him and love him and see his miracles and would be in awe of them. But there was a very distinct group of people who were actively against him and hated him. So much so that they had him killed. And not just killed. They were so much against him that they chose a murderer to be set free so that Jesus could be killed. This murderer was no ordinary murderer. He was one of the worst in their time, had done so many wrong things, and yet they did not care. They would rather see Jesus die. So although Jesus helped, blessed, and cared for thousands upon thousands of people, there were still people who hated him, who were against him. So like me, you might be wondering, why? Why would people still want to kill Jesus after all these things he's done? And I think there are two answers. Well, at least there's two answers that I can come up with. Number one, and this one's a big one, Jesus said that he was God. Now, yes, I know we have the ability and the privilege of finding out later on that, yes, Jesus was God. But think about if someone were to show up today and were to say, oh, I'm God, or I'm the Son of Man, or I'm the Son of God. How many people would actually believe him? How many people would follow him? I don't think very many would. So let's not be too quick to judge those back then, because they had no idea half of this stuff that we have today. And the second one is close to this one, to the first one, but it's really different. Right? Jesus was different. Now, yes, I mean, he was perfect, and that's pretty different. But there's a little bit more to this one. Jesus was very much a person who would challenge religious views of his time. He would really take their concepts and flip it over backwards and say, this is how it's supposed to be. And that was difficult for some people to grasp or to figure out. And let me explain as to why. So back in Jesus's time, there was a law that the religious people followed. It wasn't as much the obeying the speed limit or curfew or the stay-at-home stuff that we're doing now. No, it was more of it was a religious law. They had a couple of books from the Bible, actually the first 5 books of the Bible, called the Pentateuch, which really encapsulated what they believed. And so we would see that they would study this law over and over and over until it was memorized. They would literally study it day in and day out. And it was the word of God. So they were like, no, God said this, so therefore we must follow it. And yet we have someone who claims to be God saying that everything that God had said, he's taking it and flipping it in a different direction than what they had perceived it to be. And to them, that was hard to believe. They couldn't really figure out whether Jesus was one of the greatest teachers of all times or some crazy nutcase who couldn't really figure out what was just trying to destroy things and just trying to have fun with them and make fun of their laws. They couldn't figure that out because they were like, okay, he makes sense, but at the same time, it's completely different than what we had believed. But how do we? And so they would really just sit there and be like, I don't know, And so some of these people would just sit there and go, okay, well, we'll see where it goes. Others would take a little bit more sinister approach. They would try and trap Jesus in with his words. They would try and make him say things that would make it out to be that he was not following God's law. And one of these instances, the one we're going to talk about at least, was found in the book of Matthew. Now, Matthew is one of the books of the four Gospels. He is actually the first book in the New Testament. He is one of the, it's an interesting point of view. There's a lot of different context to it, but basically he is a Jew writing to Jewish people about Jesus, trying to get people to understand that, using a lot of Jewish language as well as Jewish tendencies with his writing. Anyways, so we see basically this passage opens up with a religious scholar. Probably I think of him more as a lawyer, someone who really has all the knowledge that you need for the law, and yet is always looking to see if people are following the law. And so he opens up and he says this. So we're going to read Matthew 22, verse 36. I already have it opened up. Again, it's Matthew 22, verse 36. I'll give you a second to open up your Bible or your phone and get to it. But here we go. This person says, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And I'll stop right there. All right, just verse 36 is, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" So a question. Okay, so in this one verse, there's a lot to unpack. The first one being when he's asking which is the greatest commandment, he's not just talking about the 10 Commandments. Those may be part of that, but if you really look at it, the law consists of something like 613-ish laws or commandments. Some of them were positive ones, some of them were negative ones, like don't do this. Some were positive, like I said, that say do this. And then there were some that were, the 10 Commandments. So this guy is basically asking, out of this big giant list of commandments, which one's the biggest? Which one's the greatest? Now, if we think back to the start of this video, it sounds pretty similar, doesn't it? I mean, he may as well be asking, Jesus, which is the greatest law? That's what he's asking. It's no different than him saying, Jesus, which Olympic athlete is the best? Okay, maybe not exactly the same, but you get the point. The greatest is what we're looking at. We're looking at the number one, the biggest one that I need to follow, the biggest one that I need to make sure that I remember to do or remember not to do. Which one is it? Here's what Jesus had to say. We're going to pick it up in that next verse. So Matthew 22, verse 37, 38. Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment." It really wasn't that shocking, was it? I didn't think so. Nobody's going to argue with that answer. I doubt anyone would even. I'm pretty sure there were probably some people like, "Oh yeah, I agree. That's a good one. That's a good one, Jesus. I think you got it." I mean, think about it. Love the Lord your God, okay? With all your heart. I can do that. With all your soul, okay? With all your mind. All right. Remember when I said that they studied this law day in and day out? Pretty sure they had this memorized by the time they were like 5. Something like that. But you get what I'm saying. It was one of the most foundational ones that you could have picked. Jesus didn't go for the obscure, didn't go for some big wow factor. Just plain old, simple one. Oh, wait. There's more. Let's continue. Verse 39. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. There's more? You had to pick one. One. Does he not know how to count? What's he doing? This was probably the thing where like, we got our answer. We agreed with you, but now you're telling us there's more? That's not how this works. The greatest. There's not really supposed to be a tie. Greatest athlete of all time. Not really supposed to be more than one. It's like having 2 winners at The Voice. Okay, maybe, well, you get what I'm saying. It's like in a race, first place goes to first and then to second. But they're all first. So first and first got first. And then there was third. Not really making much sense here, Jesus. But then he hits it with him and says, love your neighbor as yourself. There's a lot in that one. This isn't just a simple one. It's got a lot of meaning, a lot of different areas that it goes into. And I don't know about you, but the second one probably haven't been doing too well at. You see, according to Jesus, the most important thing that about us is what we're for, not what we're against. If you ever get a chance to look at Jesus's big picture the whole time he's been on earth, and I hope you do, like I said, it's recorded in those four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Start with Mark. It's the simplest one. Really doesn't have too much to it. Really easy to read and has a lot that you can pull from it without it actually being super deep. But you'll see tons of interactions between Jesus and others, and Jesus really shows us what it means for that second greatest commandment, second part of the greatest commandment. There you go. All of his interactions that he had were ones that showed how to love your neighbor. Jesus rarely responded with what he was against. Rarely did Jesus say, I am against all of that. Normally, the things that he was supposed to be against, he hung out with. He hung out with sinners, tax collectors, the lowest of the low. The people who, and the religious leaders of that day and the law that they followed, were bad people. Were the people that God was against. And I'm pretty sure people wanted to know who Jesus was and what Jesus thought about certain groups. Maybe different ethnicities, different genders, old versus young, people who had lots of power and none at all, religious backgrounds, no religious background, different choices that they made that led to different things, maybe bad behaviors, had nothing good to offer anybody, seemed to just slide on by. And if you study all of those interactions that Jesus has, and yes, he probably does have the interaction with 90% of what I just listed, if not all of them, what would you see? Pretty sure you'd notice one thing. Most of the time, Jesus's controversy, people who were didn't know how to treat Jesus, didn't know what he was all about. All of that revolved around the people he loved and the people that he was there for. Because when you love someone, you're for that person. You want that person to win. You want that person to succeed. You may not agree with all of the choices that they've made, but in the end, you're hoping that everything turns out great for that person. Still, like Jesus did, he ate with sinners, embraced outcasts, and loved people who were supposed to be unloved. And all of the religious people lost their minds. They could not understand Jesus' message of being for someone. And that message that Jesus gave about being for someone honestly changed the world. Now, think back to the start of what we just talked about. When you see that Jesus was for those that were downtrodden, those that were sinners, and you hear what Jesus said the greatest commandment was, and you take all of these things, it really only points to one truth: God is for you. Let me say that again. God is for you. Remember how we were talking about how Jesus was God who came down onto earth and was a living example of who God is. So when we say that God is for you, we mean Jesus is for you. God is not against you. He is not an against God. He is a for God. He is for you. And that's the greatest thing we could ever hear, is that God is for you. He is rooting for you. He wants you to win. He wants you to succeed in everything. He may not agree with all of your choices that you're making or about to make or have made or will make. But in the end, God is rooting for you. He is for you. Whether you've been convinced that God is against you for the longest time, or maybe you think that God is against you more than he's for you, or maybe vice versa. Whatever it is, there are two things that we can do to really take this message to heart. First one, memorize the verse. I'm not saying that you need to believe it. I'm not saying that you have to obey all of it. All I'm saying is that if you memorize it, you will have it stored away for when things don't go your way. For when you feel that God is against you and everyone is against you, you will remember this verse, these verses. Matthew 22, verses 36 through 39. Teacher, what is the greatest law? The greatest commandment of the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your mind. And the second is like this: love your neighbor as yourself. I'm not saying you have to agree with what he says, but memorize it. Keep it stored away. It will come in handy. The second is this: pay attention to who is for you and who's against you. Write it down if you have to. Think about the people at home, people at your work, people at school, and even the people at church. Who is for you? Who is against you? Pay attention. Just be aware of it, because that will help you out. When Jesus spoke of the greatest commandment, he talks about who he was for. And what we learned is that God is for us. Again, God is for us. He loved us. He created us. We have a lot of worth in him. And while he could have focused on what we shouldn't do or what we should do, he didn't. He brought a message of being for us to a people who were all focused on what and who God was against. As this video ends, I want to say two more things. If you were convinced that God was against you, maybe you're still convinced. Maybe now you have a little bit of doubt as to whether he's against or for. Either way, I want to ask you this one question, and it's very important, so I'm going to make sure I read it right. How would it change my approach to God if I truly believed that he is first and foremost for me? I'm going to say it one more time. This is for you who feel that God is against you. Ask yourself this. How would it change my approach to God if I truly believed that he is first and foremost for me? Got it? Good. All right. How about you as a Christian wondering who you should be against? I want you to imagine what it would look like for you to be the for a person, even if you disagree with them. Focus on that second part of Jesus' greatest commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. Focus on how you can be for someone rather than who you should be against.